Being the child of a powerful political figure yet enduring mistreatment from that same parent was a cruel irony. The only escape seemed to lie in earning money through a game, but after finally completing it, he found himself transported inside its world. Now, he had to choose: remain under the control of the powerful, or align with the monsters and carve out a kingdom of his own. The story opened with the protagonist imagining what it would be like to win 10 billion won. Sitting before his computer, he thought about how such fortune could free him from his current life. Everyone knew him as the son of a well-known congressman, yet that fame came with suffocating pressure. He was constantly expected to uphold his father's reputation and often appeared in the media beside him. At school, a female classmate suddenly wrapped her arms around him, leaving him uneasy. She whispered for them to leave the area for a while. In the background, other students murmured about how envious they were for not being close to her. The girl led him into an alley where a few older boys waited. Together, they cornered him, questioning why he hadn't lent her more money. Startled, Jihan insisted he had already helped her the previous week and couldn't do it again. One of the boys stepped forward, threatening to expose him for running an illegal website. Cornered, Jihan retaliated by saying they were involved as well. The girl smirked and remarked that in that case, they would all have to confess. She knew the truth. If things went public, only Jihan would bear the blame. His father's reputation dragged through the mud. With a cold confidence, she stepped closer, telling him she knew he would figure something out. Later, at home, he slams the door, but he didn't expect it to his father be already waiting. The man approached, his demeanor suggesting he already knew what had happened. His gaze was sharp, his tone commanding as he warned his son not to do anything that could damage his name. Fear tightened Jihan's chest, cold sweat forming on his forehead. When he stayed silent, his father demanded an answer. Trying to stay composed, Jihan forced a smile, claiming he would not disappoint him. His father's response was cutting. There was nothing his son could do that would disappoint him more. The man ordered him to keep following his instructions without question. Frustration overtook the boy as he fled to his room. He couldn't understand why his life had to be this way. Then, a small kitten appeared, brushing against his hand. Startled, he pulled away, but the kitten meowed softly from his desk. For the first time that day, Jihan felt a faint warmth in his chest. At least the little creature seemed to care about him. The kitten leapt into his lap, its tiny paws tickling his legs. Holding it gently, the boy muttered that Ruru was the only one still staying by his side. Just then, a faint sound caught his attention, a game notification flashing across his computer screen. He looked closer and saw that he had already cleared 99 rounds. Only one remained, yet no matter what he did, he could never push through the final stage. Every attempt ended the same, with a game over. Confused, he questioned why success remained out of reach after so many tries. On a live stream, another frustrated player ranted about failing at the same point. Watching silently, Jihan remembered how this game had been released a year ago, yet no one had ever surpassed the 100th wave. Even so, he refused to give up. This was his only shot at escaping the miserable life he was trapped in. His last chance was the heart card of Rizzledrake, but even that failed to carry him through. Nearby, a grocery bag lay open with a few items inside, including a pack of cat treats. Reaching for one, the kitten accidentally stepped on his phone. A red glow filled the screen. The disassembly option had been triggered. Jihan's eyes widened in shock as he realized what had just been taken apart, the heart of Rizzledrake itself. For a moment, he froze, trying to absorb what had happened. Losing that item meant starting all over again. Panic began to creep in, but before despair could take hold, another notification popped up. It mentioned something new, a fragment of the heart. That shouldn't have been possible. Dismantling an item never produced fragments. But if this was real, then maybe he could use it. Acting on instinct, he accepted the fragment and chose to merge it with the dragon's soul. A burst of crimson light erupted from the screen. In that instant, Jihan realized this was the missing piece, the true path to completing the game. The system restarted with the new item active. The next morning, he followed his routine and went to school, though he couldn't resist sneaking the game open behind a book. When he returned home, he continued playing, even walking through the streets with his eyes on the screen. It didn't take long for him to reach the 99th stage again. With the heart fragment in hand, victory was finally within reach. Focused and determined, he began the last level. A female knight appeared on screen, cutting down the oncoming monsters. He tapped the command, hoping this time it would work, and a bolt of lightning crashed down, annihilating every enemy in sight. For the first time, it looked like he would finally win, and he did. Triumph surged through him, and Jihan almost jumped from his chair in excitement. But the moment shattered when the door burst open. His father stood there holding a golf club. Startled, Jihan froze. The look on the man's face promised nothing good. The congressman spoke coldly, saying he'd received a call from classmates who had been blackmailing his son, threatening to expose his illegal activity unless they were paid off. Terrified, Jihan tried to defend himself, stumbling over his words as he apologized. But the deputy was already poised to strike, the golf club raised high. His eyes burned with malice, and the boy could only scream in fear. Tears streamed down Jihan's face as he trembled helplessly. Without hesitation, his father brought the club down, shattering the phone into pieces. The sound of destruction echoed like the end of a nightmare. When it was over, Jihan slowly pushed himself up, voice trembling as he asked about his cat, Ruru. The response he received was cold, that he wouldn't be needing the animal anymore. That single statement ignited something inside him. His anger surged, fists clenched as he glared at the man who called himself his father. The deputy sneered, demanding to know why the boy wore that expression. Sweat trickled down Jihan's face as he demanded to know where his cat was. The man's tone remained devoid of emotion as he explained that the cat was now with Jihan's mother, a woman long gone. The words hit like a knife to the chest. Shock left the boy speechless, his body stiff with disbelief. The deputy grabbed his head, forcing him to look up, and said he only needed to obey orders from now on. Finally, the man uttered a warning, not to disappoint him again. He added that he had once believed the boy capable of great things. Then, silence. Jihan lay on the floor, his broken phone beside him. A faint sound buzzed from it, the game's voice declaring that the mission was complete. But now none of it mattered. Jihan stared blankly, feeling that life itself had lost all meaning. The voice from the device continued, speaking again, this time inviting him to another world. Before he could react, lightning ripped through the sky, flashing inside his room. The light swallowed him whole. When the brightness faded, Jihan stood in the grand hall of a castle, the heart of the game's kingdom. People surrounded him, their eyes wide with awe. They called him the legendary knight, chanting that he would be the savior of their realm. Disoriented, he tried to make sense of it all. His tears wouldn't come. It felt as though every emotion had been wiped away. Before him stood a man with a long beard, the king. The ruler studied him and asked if he truly was the legendary knight. Then recognition hit. Jihan remembered that face, those words. They were identical to the game's dialogue. The man introduced himself as King Bayless Jordia III and explained that their kingdom was under siege by monsters. Before the king could continue, a servant burst in with urgent news about the invasion. Jihan remained silent, taking in every detail. The setting, the people, the dialogue, all exactly as he remembered from the game. Once the commotion settled, the king spoke again, declaring that the situation was dire and commanding Jihan to act. He urged the young man to assume command of the knights and defend the kingdom. Jihan rose to his feet, his voice steady but heavy. He told everyone to listen closely. His mind still reeled from the loss of Ruru, and as he thought of her, he admitted that even 1,000,000,001 no longer meant anything. The knights whispered among themselves, confused, calling him weak for a supposed hero. The king silenced them and promised that if Jihan fulfilled his duty, he would be granted whatever his heart desired. That promise caught Jihan's attention. He asked if the king truly meant anything he desired. The bearded ruler assured him there was no need to worry. He simply had to obey his commands. Those words struck a nerve. They reminded Jihan of Dan Gai, his father, a man who had forced obedience under the pretense of maintaining reputation. Now the king was repeating that same pattern. The realization burned through him, and he refused outright, shouting that he wouldn't do any of it. The king's expression darkened, his confidence faltering. In front of everyone gathered, Jihan spoke of the life he'd endured. He had always been surrounded by people who cared only for themselves. Every single one, including his father, had used him for their own gain. And now, the same thing was happening again. The king didn't want a hero. He wanted another obedient pawn. Jihan made it clear he would never be that again. The king stayed silent, though his displeasure was obvious. Cursing them all under his breath, Jihan pressed the option to reject the offer. The king's servant stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. Then, the screen in front of Jihan began to glow red. In the game's storyline, this color usually meant failure, the point where the monsters invaded the kingdom and the player failed the mission. But something was different this time. A new prompt appeared, offering another choice. The monster faction had been unlocked. Jihan stared at it in silence, the meaning sinking in. Was he being chosen to lead the monsters instead of fighting them? The king's voice broke through the tension, booming across the hall. He declared that every choice came with consequence. Addressing the court, he stripped Jihan of his title, announcing that he was no longer the legendary knight. His shouting grew harsher, declaring Jihan an enemy of the kingdom, a threat to them all. As the words echoed, Jihan remained motionless, weighing the reality before him. But time was short. The king's command for his execution had already been given. Even surrounded by drawn swords, Jihan stayed calm. Blades glimmered inches from his throat, yet he stood unfazed, certain that there was still a way out. Then it happened. A surge of crimson light burst from his body, filling the room with raw energy. The king's fury turned into confusion as the radiance intensified. Jihan's selection had been completed. The system granted him new, overwhelming powers, strength that surpassed human limits. From that moment on, his purpose shifted completely. His goal was no longer to save humanity, but to erase it. He would side with the monsters and burn the kingdom to the ground. The system's voice echoed once more, promising that if he succeeded in this mission, he would earn a rare artifact, one that could return him to his original world. That thought stirred a distant memory, the day his mother had brought him the tiny kitten, Ruru. He wondered if finishing this path could bring him back to that peaceful time. Pulled back to the present, he noticed the soldiers murmuring in fear, commenting on the strange, overwhelming energy radiating from him. The king was certain he'd glimpsed a monster's silhouette, a beast unlike anything he'd seen before. Jihan scanned his new reality, realizing this twist wasn't in the original game. Soon the main objective appeared: break the defenses and wipe out the humans. Despite the change, Jihan noticed his progress still tracked like the game. Following the usual sequence should spawn a random summoning ticket. Instead, an egg materialized. The system labeled it a random egg, and Jihan chose to hatch it. Another explosion rocked the hall as the shell burst and wings cut through the dust. Soldiers froze, sensing a summon had occurred. When the form finally emerged, Jihan was stunned. He had summoned Rizoldrak, but the creature that stepped out was only a baby dragon. Level 1, tiny and absurdly cute, even nudging his hand with its tongue. The sight of it pulled his mind back to his kitten, and a new power unlocked for him: the Eye of the Supreme. This ability revealed stats for monsters and items. Seeing the little dragon calmed the knights, and they took the moment as the signal to attack. Jihan, unsure if any of this was real, didn't care. He used the eye to read Rezoldrak's skills, and found it could unleash dragon breath. He ordered the small beast to use that power just as the soldiers moved in. For a heartbeat, he feared time had run out. What began as a tiny fireball swelled into a cataclysmic blast that wiped out everyone in its path. The blast tore through the palace wall, sending rubble raining down into the village. Standing before the ragged hole, Jihan felt a raw awe at the dragon's strength. The onlookers couldn't believe a single strike had done so much. They stared, trying to name what Jihan had summoned. Thrilled and grim, Jihan admitted it surpassed everything he had expected. If events continued, he'd eventually earn one of the knight's relics. He wasn't in any rush to go back to his ruined life. He would pour himself into this mission. Drawing the king's gaze, he fixed his stare on the man and declared his intent. He would bring about humanity's destruction, driven to claim the final prize. Amid the palace chaos, others nearby whispered, wondering what on earth had just happened. Nearby, a knight sprinted with everything he had, believing he could end the fight right there. Jihan commanded the dragon to fire again. The king's servant immediately shouted for the guards to protect their ruler, and the armored soldiers rushed to form a wall of steel in front of him. Jihan raised his hand, marking the target, while the small dragon began gathering power. His intention was clear: to wipe the king out completely. Meanwhile, the approaching knight closed the distance, while the others held their shield formation tight. Jihan waited patiently for his companion to finish charging its fire. Just as the energy was about to be released, the knight reached his king's side. Relief swept through the royal guards. There was no explosion, no devastation, only silence. The knight grinned, convinced the king was safe, but Jihan quickly realized something had gone wrong. The dragon's attack hadn't worked. Its breath hadn't built enough mana, and instead of a deadly blast, only a weak puff of fire came out, barely enough to scorch the ground, leaving behind a small cloud of smoke. Seeing this, Jihan decided the best move was to wait for the cooldown to end. But as night fell, a new threat stepped forward. He studied the man approaching, one of the elite knights, ranked S among the Zodiac Order. a towering, muscular warrior known as Ares. The remaining soldiers confirmed that the king was unharmed. That realization hit Jihan hard. The situation was turning against him. From afar, the king gave a cold command. Eliminate the enemy at once. Ares raised his staff, power radiating from it. Jihan braced himself beside his dragon, weighing his next move. He knew this knight's strength. It was nothing to take lightly. Without hesitation, Ares unleashed his skill, summoning a blazing wall of fire that roared toward Jihan. He understood instantly that escape was nearly impossible. The explosion ripped through the palace, tearing more sections apart. Even friendly knights were caught in the flames. But Jihan had managed to dive aside just in time. He remembered from the game that this attack only traveled in a straight line, easy enough to avoid if you knew what to expect. Watching the destruction, he realized the knight didn't care about his own comrades. Furious, Ares cursed the dodge and promised to burn a hole straight through Jihan's heart next time. Knowing that the attack needed time to recharge, Jihan saw his window of opportunity. He had to flee, but when he lifted his head, Ares was already closing in fast. Jihan's mind raced, searching for any possible move left. He couldn't have come all this way just to end it here. Then, another reward notification appeared. A mysterious chest materialized before him. Without hesitation, he accepted the item, yelling in frustration for it to open faster. Time was running out. As the knight swung his weapon down to strike, the blow landed squarely on the chest instead. A sudden force burst out, repelling him backward. Finally, Jihan caught sight of what the chest contained. A massive sword began to rise from within. Using the Eye of the Supreme, he identified it, a weapon with immense magic power that also boosted his stats. The readout showed it was an S-rank item. Shock mixed with grim realization. It seemed the system truly intended for him to annihilate the human side. The moment the sword touched the ground, the floor cracked beneath it. Jihan stared, disbelief taking over as the entire area began to split apart. The palace floor collapsed, sending debris crashing down as he was flung into open air. Falling from such a height, he thought bitterly that even the royal palace couldn't handle the weight of a divine weapon. The ground rushed closer, the wind roaring past his ears. This could have been his end. But then, his fall suddenly stopped. Something tugged at his clothes. He looked up and saw the small dragon struggling desperately to lift him. The creature flapped its wings with all its strength, keeping him aloft. From below, the people of the kingdom looked on in shock at the sight of someone soaring through the air. Jihan, still catching his breath, wondered why his mission had to begin in enemy territory of all places. At least here, the only one who could pose real danger was Ares. Even so, he knew that stronger knights would appear soon. His first goal had to be escape. Meanwhile, back at the ruined palace, Ares aimed his weapon at his own throat in frustration. He cursed himself for failing to finish the enemy, muttering that Jihan should have been swallowed by the sea by now. Just then, a messenger arrived. The king was calling for him. The knight knelt before his ruler, asking for punishment for allowing the criminal to flee. But the king ordered him to stop, reminding him that dusk was near. Ares froze, realizing what that meant. Nighttime was when the monsters grew stronger. The king then appointed him commander of the walls and sent him to the front lines. High above, Jihan drifted in the sky, recalling the early stages of the game. The same pattern of monster attacks, beginning with wild goblins. But with Ares present, he knew those beasts wouldn't make much progress at first. Then he noticed the ground approaching again. The baby dragon's wings trembled. It was losing strength fast. Despite its effort, Rezeldrak couldn't hold him any longer. Both of them plummeted sharply, crashing back toward the kingdom below. The crash sent both of them slamming into a stone pillar, the impact echoing through the ruined area. Despite the collision, Jihan emerged unscathed. Right beside him, a pair of boots lay abandoned. Without hesitation, he slipped them on. Before he could move again, a voice cut through the silence. A young blonde girl stood nearby, staring at him with suspicion. She didn't recognize his face. Her name was Lib, an S-rank knight. She immediately demanded to know who he was. Jihan recognized her instantly. In the game, Lib had been a crucial figure in stopping the 100th wave. Though scatterbrained at times, she excelled at dungeon farming and had grown powerful enough to take down monsters on her own. When she repeated her demand for identification, Jihan addressed her by name. The reaction was immediate. Confusion flickered in her eyes as she asked how he knew her. Jihan replied that he knew her well, having already gauged her worth. The words meant nothing to her, but for him, this was a warning. She was now an enemy, and he would have to deal with her sooner or later. As night descended, Chaos spread across the kingdom. Outside the city walls, the Doblins gathered, ready to storm the gates. The soldiers shouted orders, warning that the monsters were already within range. They readied their bows and unleashed volleys of arrows. Some of the creatures began scaling the walls, forcing the defenders to hurl stones down at them. The air filled with screams, clanging metal, and the deep roar of the invasion. One of the knights muttered that they couldn't hold out much longer. Another shouted that Dryce was on his way to reinforce them. Meanwhile, in another corner of the battlefield, Lib's interrogation continued. She warned that if Jihan refused to answer, she would act on her own. Jihan thought about eliminating her immediately, but realized it was impossible for now. He'd have to bluff his way through. He claimed to be an ordinary citizen from District 1, simply trying to assist in the defense. Before Lib could question further, his small dragon appeared beside him. The knight's eyes widened at the sight of the creature, her body tensing. It was, after all, a monster. Sweat formed on Jihan's forehead. Rezeldrak wasn't supposed to show up yet. The girl's suspicious look made it clear she was on edge, and he struggled to think of an excuse. But before he could speak, Lib stepped forward, sword raised defensively. She declared that she would protect him from the beast. The baby dragon tilted its head, letting out a confused, almost innocent expression. Lib's gaze hardened, but the creature didn't react aggressively. Slowly, she realized the little monster wasn't hostile at all. Then, a thunderous explosion erupted nearby, shaking the ground. Lib's attention snapped toward the noise, and Jihan seized the moment. He motioned to his dragon and bolted from the area, vanishing into the chaos of the night. It wasn't the soldiers' fault that their weapons had slipped from control, but by the time Lib turned her gaze back toward where Jihan had been, both he and his creature were already gone. A soldier ran up to her, shouting about the gate. The look on his face made her heart tighten. Whatever was happening there was bad. Loud, pounding strikes echoed from that direction. Inside, the guards waited in tense silence, their fear written across their faces as the gate began to splinter under pressure. Lib arrived just in time, commanding the soldiers to prepare for close combat. Archers drew their bows, aiming at the horde of goblins swarming beyond the wall. Among them stood one far larger than the rest, a giant whose sheer strength was enough to break through at any moment. With a roar, the massive goblin swung its weapon, and the gate burst apart. Lib tightened her grip on her sword, calling her troops to charge. The soldiers braced themselves as the enormous creature led the invasion. But before the monsters could advance any further, flames burst across the battlefield. Riz appeared, his arrival catching even Lib off guard. Seeing the breach, he unleashed his fire skill without hesitation, engulfing the enemy ranks. The goblins screamed as the flames devoured them. Standing tall, Riz smirked at the devastation, remarking that the monsters still had a long way to go. High on a distant ridge, Jihan watched the clash unfold below. His goal now was no longer to protect humanity, but to see it burn. Beside him, his small dragon let out a curious sound, prompting him to rest his hand on its head. The creature's attention suddenly shifted upward. Rain had begun to fall. It looked eager to play in it, but Jihan held it back, not wanting it to cause trouble. Back in the kingdom, the humans celebrated a narrow victory. Lib felt uneasy, knowing she hadn't been the one to turn the tide this time. Far away, in the dark forest, Jihan noticed movement. Someone, or something, was approaching. He recalled that he had spawned far from the city walls and realized he was now deep in monster territory. That made things complicated. He had no clear path forward. He had replayed the game hundreds of times before and knew every tactic by heart. But this time was different. He'd have to rebuild from nothing. Then a thought struck him. Turning to his side, he spotted his small companion still nearby. Moments later, Rezeldrak darted off toward the opposite direction. Jihan followed his gaze and froze. On the forest floor, a colony of ants was working tirelessly, dragging pieces of food and dirt. One of them noticed the dragon's presence and froze in fear. Rezeldrak crouched low, watching them closely, fascinated. Pulling his companion aside, Jihan exhaled slowly and began thinking of his next move. Out of nowhere, a new mission prompt appeared before Jihan's eyes. The objective was clear. He had to create a faction of monsters. He paused, trying to figure out how to even start that. If he needed to recruit monsters like goblins, now would be the perfect moment, but there weren't any nearby. He wondered how he would even communicate with them if he found some. That was when something unusual moved in his peripheral vision. By the time he turned, it was already upon him. A sudden strike came fast. Someone was trying to kill him. The blade glinted inches from his neck, and a figure stood right in front of him. His eyes widened in confusion. Claws grazed his skin. When he focused on his attacker, recognition struck. The figure was a young girl, a beastkin, a hybrid between human and animal. Jihan instinctively labeled her as a rabbit, but her reaction showed she didn't appreciate that. She snapped back, insisting she resembled a fox instead, and even tried to justify it. Their argument lingered in the air, her irritation obvious. Remaining calm, Jihan studied her more closely and finally realized she truly did resemble an Arctic fox. The girl leaned closer, sniffing the air. Then she began circling him, her nose brushing against his clothes as she took in his scent. Her tone shifted. She admitted that while he looked human, his scent was undeniably that of a monster. That revelation startled Jihan. Moments later, 2 new notifications appeared. The first granted him the ability to communicate with other beings. The second gave him natural charisma, increasing how positively others perceived him. With that, Jihan understood why he was able to converse with her so easily. Still, the girl didn't seem entirely at ease. Her questions came rapid and suspicious. Who was he really? Jihan felt uneasy, wondering if the attraction skill wasn't working as intended. Then a sudden movement interrupted everything. A rope shot across his face, snapping past him and catching someone nearby. The sound of impact was followed by a cry of pain. 3 men emerged from the shadows, cheering as they realized they'd captured their target. Jihan froze, realizing how far things had spiraled. Judging from their words, he understood that he had been outside the human kingdom for almost a year. The fox girl, snarling, turned toward him with fury. She accused him of being human and of luring her into a trap. Her anger burned through every word as she shouted that she wouldn't fall for it. Wincing in pain, she demanded to know why they never stopped hunting her. Jihan quickly understood. There had been a misunderstanding from the start. The humans began pulling the rope again, and the girl's body lifted off the ground. The arrow lodged in her leg twisted as she was yanked upward. The largest man in the group braced himself, pulling hard on the line, but the girl seized the chance to retaliate, preparing to strike back with all her strength. Jihan stayed back and watched, waiting to see how things would unfold. The fox girl took a hard punch to the face, but the human attacker hadn't counted on a reply. She slammed her other leg into him, the kick landing with enough force to send the big man sprawling. His 2 companions fumed at the sight. Jihan thought the girl was small, but fierce. One of the men stormed over, cursing her for defending herself, and then stamped a boot down on her head to shut her up. Jihan's body remained still as the abuse continued. The fox girl writhed under their blows, and anger began to rise in him. Another hunter moved closer and asked if everything was fine, assuming Jihan was human and warning him about the danger in the area. He questioned why Jihan was alone. The fox kept chattering, but the man didn't understand her tongue. Ready to strike something nearby in punishment, he lifted his hand, but the group leader ordered him to stop, arguing she might die if hit. The short man muttered an apology for losing control, which eased Jihan. He'd feared she might be killed. The leader's mood turned sharp. He accused Jihan of speaking with the girl earlier, then shoved a knife into Jihan's stomach to prove a point. Blood slicked the blade as it clattered to the ground. Jihan clutched his wound and tried to make sense of the threat. The fox watched him close and slowly realized he wasn't an enemy. Heat flared through Jihan's body. The stab had been meant to kill, but vital points had been missed on purpose. Spitting out blood, he felt the poison taking hold. The leader coldly declared Jihan would be dead within 12 hours, unless he translated what the monsters said, brandishing an antidote as leverage. They held the fox captive, forcing Jihan to act as interpreter to learn where her clan lived. Jihan had never even known a fox people village existed. Confusion roiled through him, while the hunters explained that such a settlement did lie hidden nearby. The fox girl suddenly lunged, bared her fangs, and moved as if to bite her own tongue to end it all, a desperate act to avoid betrayal. The man yanked her back and stopped her. Watching that, Jihan understood how fiercely tied she must be to whatever family or pack she protected. The young girl's mouth was forced shut as the men mocked her, calling her a wild beast. The leader repeated that if she revealed her tribe's location, both she and Jihan might live. The word struck Jihan like a memory. He recalled that same cold, calculating stare from his old schoolmate, the one who used to blackmail him. Back then, he had lived under constant fear, always following orders, always being used. To everyone else, he was nothing but a tool to exploit. But this time, he refused to let things play out the same way. Despite the pain searing through his wound, he forced himself to move closer to the fox girl. He told her to lead them to the village, assuring that no one would get hurt. The men around him believed every word, convinced now that he could truly communicate with monsters. Lowering her head, the girl whispered that over 100 of her kind lived there, then asked if she could really trust him. Jihan held her gaze for a moment before admitting he wasn't on the side of humans. With one hand pressed to his bleeding stomach, he confessed he knew exactly how cruel they could be. As he turned forward, something caught his attention. His dragon was sneaking up behind the hunters, charging up its destructive energy. Fear shot through him. If this went wrong, they'd both die. He tried to stay calm, pretending nothing was happening while buying time for Rezeldrak to finish gathering power. But his shift in demeanor didn't go unnoticed. The leader eyed him suspiciously, and the short man to the side spotted the creature, shouting a warning. The leader spun around, but by then, Jihan was sure enough time had passed. The dragon's red flames blazed to life, yet, to his disbelief, only a weak burst came out. The attack fizzled instantly. Jihan froze, stunned that it had failed again. The hunters stared, equally baffled, and even the poor dragon looked confused by the tiny spark it produced. Jihan realized then that Rezeldrak hadn't recovered enough energy yet. The big man laughed, saying the blast was pathetic, though strong enough to burn if it had hit directly. Without hesitation, the leader snatched up a metal bat, calling the dragon a useless insect, and swung. Jihan could only watch as the blow connected. His small companion was launched through the air, hitting the ground hard and rolling several times before going limp. Dizzy and trembling, the creature lay motionless. Furious, the man cursed the dragon for daring to resist and advanced again, raising the bat for another strike. Jihan's body refused to move. He could only stare helplessly. The leader ordered his subordinates to restrain Jihan and the fox, while he dealt with the dragon himself. Rezeldrak remained on the ground, unconscious. Grinding his teeth, Jihan felt the same bitter truth sink in. Once again, he only held value because of what he could do for others. Everything was repeating exactly as it had in his old world. He had spent his whole life living in humiliation, constantly bending himself just to satisfy others. Yet no matter how much he tried, he always ended up isolated and unwanted. Whatever happened, he knew one thing. He would never go back to that miserable reality. From that moment on, he swore he would never regret anything again. The leader raised his weapon, ready to crush the small dragon. Even the fox girl froze, horrified at what was about to unfold. Jihan's face hardened, and his body reacted instinctively. His passive monster ability activated, surging through him like fire. In a flash, he crossed the distance between them and swung his fist. The strike landed with bone-shattering force, sending the leader hurtling through the air. The ground split beneath the impact. The fox girl stood speechless, stunned by his raw strength, while the remaining henchmen stared in disbelief. Their leader lay motionless, face ruined beyond recognition. For once, Jihan had acted before it was too late. But in the chaos, the antidote that could have saved him shattered to pieces. The fox girl stared, confused by how he was even moving with poison coursing through his veins. Jihan ignored the pain and rushed to his fallen companion. Rezeldrak's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed Jihan's face. He was proud of the little dragon for fighting until the end. The creature gave a small, joyful grin in return. Looking at him, Jihan felt a rush of warmth. The sight reminded him of Ruru, his little cat who had always stayed close, trying to comfort him when no one else did. That memory filled him with resolve. He made a silent promise. He would protect his new companion no matter what. His expression softened as he smiled faintly, thinking that, no matter what the future held, he and his partner would stand together. Behind them, the surviving hunters spat curses, threatening to report everything to their boss. Jihan turned toward them with cold fury, his glare enough to make them hesitate. Realizing what would come next, they panicked and fled into the woods. Rezeldrak cheered weakly, proud of their victory. But the moment didn't last. Jihan's body gave out, his legs collapsing beneath him. He hit the ground hard as the fox girl rushed over. She stared in shock, thinking he might be gone. The little dragon whimpered, nudging his shoulder desperately. Jihan's eyes fluttered. His breathing was shallow, and he felt his strength slipping away. This had to be the end. His last image before blacking out was Rezeldrak's worried face hovering over him. Then came the memory, the hospital room, the beeping machines, his mother lying frail and pale. He'd been alone back then too, abandoned while his father never once came to see them. The memory burned through him with the same ache as before. Slowly, consciousness crept back. When he opened his eyes, he realized he was being carried. The fox girl held him firmly as they made their way through a dark, winding cave. Soon, light appeared ahead. They emerged into a quiet village filled with beastkin, most of them resembling rabbits. The residents froze upon seeing him, whispering among themselves. Despite his human appearance, they could all sense it. His scent was that of a monster. They lingered near the window, whispering to each other, wondering when he would wake. But Jahan was already conscious. He simply didn't want that much attention. The fox girl soon stepped forward, asking the others to give him some room. From where he lay, Jahan immediately recognized her voice. When she entered, she asked if he was awake and explained that his presence had drawn interest. It was the first time anyone had seen a human in their village, and besides, he didn't even smell like one. Looking down at his hands, Jahan noticed something. The mark left by the poison was gone. The fox girl told him they had kept him in the village to recover. That was when it struck him. She had brought him here herself, risking her safety for someone who had once been her captor. She had saved his life. Puzzled, he asked why she did it. She replied that, despite how he looked, she could tell he wasn't truly one of them. Unsatisfied, he pressed her for another reason. Her eyes softened as she recalled a moment, how his concern for his dragon had moved her. Jahan wondered if that compassion was only the side effect of his friendly monster ability, but the girl grew irritated, snapping that he was still complaining even after being rescued. Nearby, Rezeldrak stirred from his nap. When the dragon opened his eyes and saw Jahan awake, his tail began to flick excitedly. Yet he noticed immediately that Jahan and the fox were already bickering. The girl folded her arms, saying that now they were even. He had saved her once too. Before Jahan could respond, a cheerful sound filled the air. Rezeldrak bounded toward him and jumped into his arms, nuzzling his chest while the fox watched silently. She broke the moment, saying they should at least know each other's names. But before she could speak, another villager appeared, announcing that the chief wanted to see them. They set off together, and as they walked, Jahan couldn't help but marvel at what he saw. The hidden settlement, tucked beyond the mountains, had been built by rabbit-type monsters. Over time, it had become a refuge for all hybrid species who had lost their homes. The residents worked together in peace, caring for one another with quiet devotion. Their path was soon blocked by a towering bull-type beast who demanded to know if the fox, Rhea, had gone to the human forest. She apologized quickly and continued on, but the bull's suspicious gaze lingered. Jahan called her by name, remarking that everyone here seemed to care about her deeply. Rhea lowered her eyes, her tone darkening when he asked if something was wrong. Then, suddenly, her mood flipped. She frowned, tilting her head, and asked why everyone called him Hey. Stepping closer, she demanded to know if that was really his name. Caught off guard by her confusion, Jahan finally introduced himself properly. The name sounded strange, out of place in this world. Without hesitation, the fox girl gave her full name, Rylindrian Pernidae Celiard, before turning away, leaving Jahan standing there, completely bewildered. One of the small rabbit villagers asked if Rhea was feeling any better, and she replied that she was. Jahan noticed her mood had lifted. It seemed all she'd really wanted was to share her name. As he looked around, his thoughts drifted back to his main goal, building a faction of monsters. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when Rhea called for him to keep moving. Even now, she still called him, Hey, and that small detail bothered him. Still, he jogged forward to catch up. When they reached the village chief, the old rabbit suddenly announced that Jahan would now take charge of the settlement. Both Jahan and Rhea froze in disbelief. Jahan quickly said he had no idea how to lead a village, but the old rabbit simply waved him off, saying he was too old to continue. Rhea demanded to know if the elder was really making such a decision just because of a dream. The old rabbit nodded, insisting that he wouldn't change his mind. Jahan stood there confused, trying to make sense of the situation. The elder explained that every dream he'd had always come true, and in this one, the person destined to save the village was Jahan. That word, savior, echoed in Jahan's mind. It reminded him of his current mission, establishing a monster faction. The title unsettled him. Being seen as a savior could only complicate things. He remembered that cursed man who had once tried to use him as a translator in exchange for his life. The thought sparked a sudden worry. He turned to Rhea and asked if anyone might have followed them on the way back. She assured him that the village's location was impossible to find. Hidden beyond the mountains, it was bordered by a vast, dangerous sea that no one dared to cross. The only other path lay through an underwater tunnel that twisted like a maze, designed to keep intruders out. According to her, she hadn't sensed anyone nearby. Still, Jahan couldn't shake a bad feeling. On the trail they had taken, faint streaks of red marked the ground. Blood, likely Rhea's. And deep within one of the caves nearby, a hidden figure watched the village. One of the human henchmen had found it and was already grinning to himself, celebrating the discovery. Moments later, Noise erupted in the village, shouts spreading through the crowd. Someone was yelling about an intruder. Jahan and Ria both froze as the words reached them. A human had been found inside the settlement. The bull beast immediately grew tense, cursing under his breath, while one of the smaller villagers muttered in confusion. Jahan rushed forward, asking if the intruders had followed them. Ria's face went pale. Shaken, she asked if the humans had been trailing her all along, insisting she'd made sure no one had. Then, guilt written all over her face, she began to apologize, saying it was her fault. But the bull shook his head firmly, saying it wasn't. The bull told Ria not to blame herself, saying she'd simply been too weak to notice what was happening. Her friends echoed his words, trying to comfort her, insisting it wasn't her fault. Jahan's thoughts drifted back to the men who had ambushed them. There had been 3 of them. The short one, still in the village, grinned darkly and warned that the whole place would soon be burning. His voice carried a cruel edge as he revealed he was part of a group called the Screaming Hall. Within minutes, he said, 200 men would arrive. Jahan's brow furrowed. The name meant nothing to him at first. What was this Screaming Hall? Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the other 2 henchmen limped along, battered but alive. The leader of the trio stumbled into his superior's tent, still crying from the beating, demanding revenge. The man sitting before him didn't respond right away. He listened in silence as they explained what had happened. Then, one of them shouted that they had found the Fox village and could lead the way. The boss of the Screaming Hall smiled thinly, pleased with the discovery. He ordered his men to move out immediately. His servant, nearly shaking with excitement, rushed to prepare. Back in the village, the short henchman laughed to himself, boasting that he wasn't the only one who had made it this far. He explained that all 3 of them had followed Ria through the forest. Their leader had told them not to return yet. It was the perfect chance to track the girl and find her people. His laughter turned cruel as he claimed that soon everyone there would die. The young fox looked confused, unable to understand his words, though she sensed the malice behind them. She turned to Jahan, calling his name in alarm. His expression darkened as he explained that their location had been exposed and reinforcements were on the way. Ria froze, horror settling over her. Jahan's mind began to race as he tried to piece everything together. The name Screaming Hall stirred something familiar, a memory from the game Night Defense. In that game, players earned experience by fending off endless monster waves, but leveling alone wasn't enough to survive. There was another mechanic, the Adventurer's System, where players could send knights on missions through 100 stages, from the ruins of the Wild Goblins to the Demon Fortress. Jahan remembered the final part clearly, a stage involving the hideout of a gang called Screaming All, hidden behind a rocky hill. The story attached to that stage matched exactly what he was hearing now. Yet his anxiety grew. None of this terrain matched any stage he remembered. According to the game's map, this entire region was supposed to be destroyed. The short man broke the silence again, offering a deal. If someone released him, he promised that his boss would spare their lives. Jahan knew only he could understand the man's words, but he didn't need to translate. The hybrids could feel what those words meant. Ria lowered her head, guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. She whispered that this was all her fault. The captured man kept shouting, demanding to be freed. Jihan's expression hardened. He wasn't about to let the village be destroyed. While the short, obnoxious prisoner continued to rant, Jihan stepped closer. The man sneered and told him to translate his words for everyone else. But Jihan wasn't in the mood. His fist tightened, and with one swift motion, he drove it straight into the man's face. The blow sent the henchman flying, his scream echoing through the clearing. The bull hybrid stood frozen, astonished by Jihan's strength. Even the small rabbit villagers stared wide-eyed, stunned. Ria, too, couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. The man lay motionless on the ground, barely conscious, while Jihan stood firm, ready to fight if it came to that. Ria's heart pounded as she heard him say he would do anything to protect them. But the bull stepped forward, explaining grimly that fighting was impossible. The village was filled with the weak, mostly women, children, and the elderly. Just then, the old chief appeared and called everyone together. As the villagers gathered, he raised his voice and made a declaration that left everyone speechless. Jihan would be the new chief of the village. Far away, the mercenary gang advanced through the forest. Their leader's eyes gleamed as they reached the rocky hill. The reports had been true. The Fox village was hidden right behind it. Grinning, he announced that this place would soon serve as their new base. With that, he ordered his men forward. Back in the village, the bull explained their situation. The enemy force was about 200 strong. Their own group was tiny. Only a few bull warriors, 2 young deer, 5 sheep hybrids, and 1 fox girl. Including the rabbits, their total barely reached 112. He asked Jihan if they stood any chance. Jihan replied bluntly that the enemy's strength was nearly double theirs. But then a thought struck him. Numbers weren't everything. He remembered how Rhea had fought those men on her own, and realized that if she could handle 3 by herself, others might not be as helpless as they seemed. Even if the villagers lacked combat experience, hybrids were known to grow stronger when transforming into their animal forms. If everyone had even a fraction of Rhea's strength, there was hope. He turned to the bull and asked how powerful she truly was. The hybrid scratched his chin, watching the fox play with the small dragon nearby, then admitted she was easily the strongest in the village. The statement left Jihan silent. The bull added that even if every villager united against her, Rhea would still emerge victorious. That truth sank heavy in Jihan's mind. Knowing this, he realized he had to act fast. His head dropped slightly as he weighed the consequences. Compared to her, the rest of the villagers were practically defenseless. As they discussed their next move, the young fox mentioned that there was still time before the humans arrived. Jihan frowned, not understanding how she could be so sure. She pointed to the short prisoner, explaining that she had asked him directly. Jihan recalled that one of the henchmen had said their boss was searching for something he had lost. He turned to Rhea, asking if she had any idea what that might be. The girl shook her head and said their village was nothing more than a small refuge for displaced creatures. Hearing that, Jihan guessed the enemy might be using that as a convenient excuse for invasion. Before he could think further, the bull hybrid Tor called out that everyone had gathered. It was time for Jihan to present a plan. He knew that to stand a chance against superior numbers, individual stats would have to compensate for their lack of manpower. The strongest fighter among them was the fox girl. He'd confirmed that much. If she could handle 3 opponents at once, their odds might improve, but even then, he wasn't certain. He began to wonder if raw power depended on species, and thought how useful it would be if he could see everyone's stats. Then it hit him, the Demon Eye ability. Maybe it could analyze what he needed. In the game, he had triggered it by opening the status screen, so he attempted the same, but nothing happened. He frowned, frustration tightening his chest. Nothing appeared, and the silence around him only made it worse. A moment later, however, a faint red glow flickered before his eyes. An inventory window. It was empty. Still, one detail stood out. Its title wasn't the same as when he had played on the kingdom's side. That difference reminded him of something bitter. Back in the kingdom, he had obtained that incredibly powerful sword, the one strong enough to destroy the entire palace. Now he felt a stab of regret for having left it behind. Since the inventory window had appeared, he couldn't understand why the status screen refused to open. He went through his abilities in his mind. 4 passives. The Demon Eye that revealed information, the power to communicate with both humans and monsters, the charisma that attracted others to him, and finally, his monstrous physical strength that surpassed human limits. Annoyed, he muttered that he needed to make a decision soon. The fox tried to steady herself, saying she would follow his lead, her voice tinged with guilt. She blamed herself for the crisis and insisted she had to protect the village. Jihan could tell the weight of that guilt was crushing her, and time was slipping away fast. Then suddenly his right eye burned with light. A crimson gleam flooded his vision. When he looked at the fox, lines of information flickered faintly across her face. Focusing, he realized he could lock onto a target. The realization hit him immediately. The ability worked through intent. It activated whenever he looked at someone and consciously decided what he wanted to examine. The red glow sharpened in Jihan's eye, and a set of numbers and letters appeared before him. He saw his own classification. Rank B. A small surge of excitement hit him. That ranking matched an average knight's level in the game. Shifting his focus, he turned his attention toward Rhea. Her stats appeared clearly, and one thing stood out. Her attack power far exceeded the rest. While she continued speaking beside him, Jihan wasn't paying attention. His mind was locked on the glowing skill window. A small heart icon caught his eye, and he wondered what it represented. Instinctively, he reached out to touch it. Only when Rhea flinched did he realize what he'd done. His finger had poked her nose. Trying to brush it off, he muttered that it hadn't been intentional. But the fox girl's face flushed with anger, and in the next second she lunged at him, claws out. After the brief scuffle, Jihan called for Tor, asking him to gather everyone in the village. A thin scratch now marked his cheek, but he assured them it was nothing serious. Soon, the villagers assembled just as he requested. He needed them all in one place to analyze their stats. The process was long and exhausting, each scan draining his focus. When it was finally over, he exhaled in relief. The results confirmed what he had suspected. He could now tell who was strong and who wasn't. Even as a hatchling, Rezeldrak was still the most powerful among them. His attacks carried immense destructive force, though they drained all his mana in one burst. With that limitation, Jihan knew the dragon wouldn't be able to fight this time. That left only Rhea, a rank B, and Tor, who was rank C. The rest of the villagers fell into lower tiers, the weakest of all. Even without seeing the enemy levels, Jihan could guess the approaching mercenaries averaged around rank C. The realization tightened his chest. They were outmatched in every way, fewer in number, lacking proper skills and equipment. Under these conditions, defending the village would be impossible, but this wasn't a game anymore. The rules were different here. He looked around the settlement and began thinking. If he couldn't rely on stats, he could rely on the environment, create variables that wouldn't exist in a game. His mind raced with possibilities. Calling Rhea and Tor over, he told them they needed to plan a new strategy. Meanwhile, far beyond the mountain, the gang pressed forward. Their leader walked at the front, flanked by 2 rabbit scouts moving ahead to check the path. The young male rabbit turned to his sister, whispering that they should return to warn the others. Before they could move, a sharp sound cut the air. The boy dropped instantly, struck in the head. The girl froze, horrified, staring at her brother's body lying motionless on the ground. The one who had struck him was the screaming hall leader himself. A cruel grin spread across the man's face as he stepped past the corpse, leaving the girl trembling. Tears welled in her eyes before she shut them tight and bolted, shifting into her rabbit form as she fled through the forest. One of the henchmen asked if they should chase her, but the leader waved him off with a smirk. His voice was low and venomous as he said there was no need. He was already spreading the infection. The village was in motion, every hybrid working together to put the plan into action. Tension filled the air as they prepared for what was coming. Then, through the misty entrance, the little rabbit who had escaped earlier came running, her eyes wide with panic. Jahan immediately noticed she was alone. The girl stumbled forward, shouting that the humans had already arrived. Even Tor, the bull, froze at her words. Rhea stepped forward, confused, asking why the rabbit's fur was soaked in red liquid, but the girl was too terrified to explain clearly. She kept repeating the same thing. The humans were already here. Despite the panic spreading around him, Jahan stayed composed. He was the first line of defense for the monster faction, and he was ready. Gritting his teeth, he swore he wouldn't let the village fall. Far from the village, the mercenary gang finally reached the cave entrance. Their leader asked if this was truly the fox's den, and his men confirmed it. Confident, they pushed forward, determined to finish everything before sunset. Back in the village, Rhea's ears twitched. Her heightened senses caught something. The humans were getting closer. She turned toward Jahan, asking if he was sure the plan would work. The gang kept moving deeper, following the mapped route. The leader estimated they would reach the village within 30 minutes. The air felt still, almost too quiet, and he muttered that the silence meant they were being watched. One of his hairy subordinates grinned, promising to take revenge for the humiliation they'd suffered before. Then a sound broke the stillness, a faint creak beneath their boots. The ground began to tremble. Cracks spread rapidly across the tunnel floor before anyone could react. With a loud crash, the ground gave way. Several men plummeted into the hole, shouting in pain as they hit the bottom. Those who stayed above backed away just in time, dust and gravel raining over them. The leader barely managed to grab one of his men by the arm, pulling him from the edge. Below, groans filled the air. Some had twisted legs and broken bones. The hairy subordinate growled that the villagers had laid traps along the path. The leader's face darkened as he examined the floor ahead. He realized what had happened. The enemy had dug pits and covered them with wooden boards disguised by dust and debris. Any heavy step was enough to make the ground collapse. Another man muttered that none of this had been here the day before. The leader didn't respond. Instead, he moved forward, his patience thinning. As his men followed, he cursed under his breath, their confusion growing as they watched him pick up a large rock with ease. Without warning, he hurled it ahead. The stone slammed into the ground and instantly broke through it. Another pit trap. The leader smirked. He explained that the tunnel was originally solid rock, which made it easy to tell where traps had been dug. Any section filled with loose dirt or gravel would collapse. Following his lead, his men began to spot the differences. The rocky patches were safe, while the dusty ones were not. Feeling satisfied, the leader declared that humans like them wouldn't fall for such simple tricks again. He ordered a few of his men to stay behind and pull the injured out of the hole. Meanwhile, inside the village, Rhea's sharp ears caught faint echoes. The the sound of the enemy realizing their traps had been discovered. Jihan grinned. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. He had counted on the enemy discovering the traps. Digging through the rock would slow them down for hours, and even if it only worked once, it was enough. In truth, there were only 2 real traps. The rest were fake, just decoys to waste their time. That was the point, to stall them for as long as possible. Deeper inside the tunnel, the gang pressed forward. Some of the men moved cautiously now, terrified of another pitfall. As they advanced, one of the subordinates warned that a crossroads was up ahead. When the leader saw it, he frowned. There weren't 2 paths like before. There were 3. The long-haired man muttered that he didn't remember a split like this, swearing that it hadn't been there earlier. He pointed out a bush near the wall, recognizing it as a clear sign of deception. The leader narrowed his eyes, realizing what was happening. It was another stall tactic. They were trying to buy time, probably preparing something inside the village. He wouldn't let that happen. He ordered his troops to divide into smaller squads. The long-haired man would take the left tunnel. The large brute would lead the middle route. The leader himself would go right. The left group advanced first, only to hit a dead end where the tunnel had collapsed. Meanwhile, the middle group spotted faint light ahead and assumed it was the exit. Their commander signaled everyone to get ready for a fight. The left group soon saw light too, convincing them they were also near the surface. Believing he had chosen the correct path, the leader ordered that no hybrid should be left alive. The group surged forward without hesitation. But on the right-hand path, the one the leader took, things were different. His squad emerged not into the village, but into the middle of the forest. He realized immediately that he had been misled again. Back at the true exit, the middle group broke through into the village perimeter. Their commander barked an order to hold position and sent one of the men back to alert the boss. The runner turned, only to find a strange sight. One of their own was tied to a tree, gagged and struggling. The bound man's eyes darted wildly. Sweat poured down his face as muffled cries escaped the cloth in his mouth. He tried to ask for the boss, but before anyone could react, he noticed something. They were surrounded. The messenger spun around and bolted back toward the crossroads. He had to warn the leader. But before he could reach the tunnel bend, the air erupted with a deafening blast. A wave of smoke burst through the cave, throwing several men against the stone walls. The explosion had come from above. The fox girl and Jihan had triggered it perfectly. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The traps had done their job. Every second they bought mattered. The enemy's forces were now scattered and divided across the tunnels. After hearing what happened to the earlier group, the short man grew uneasy, his confidence fading fast. Suddenly, the large brute turned his head, catching movement from the shadows. All around them, the villagers were waiting, hidden and ready to strike. Jihan stepped out beside Rhea, emerging from the darkness. Taking charge, he signaled the villagers to move. From a high ledge overlooking the battlefield, he watched with satisfaction as the plan unfolded perfectly. The opposing commander barked orders for his own men to counterattack. Both sides now stood face to face, the air tense, seconds away from erupting into chaos. The mercenary leader hefted his massive hammer, preparing to crush anyone who got in his way. Jihan raised his voice, giving a single command. It was time for the hybrids to transform. In an instant, smoke burst across the area, swallowing everything. The human soldiers staggered, confused, wondering if the villagers had vanished. But it was all part of the plan. Jihan had learned earlier that when the beast folk transformed, their bodies released a dense mist. He'd turned that natural trait into a battle tactic. Hidden in the haze, no one could tell where the next strike would come from. From within the cloud, Tor the bull emerged first, gripping a massive stone above his head. He charged forward with brute force. Further out, human soldiers called out in panic, unsure what was happening. The smaller rabbit fighters seized the moment. They targeted the isolated ones, launching surprise attacks while others dug beneath the ground, grabbing ankles and throwing enemies off balance. Distracted soldiers were suddenly hit from above, swift kicks to the face and chest from unseen directions. One young mercenary screamed and bolted, overwhelmed by the chaos. Elsewhere, 3 men tried to subdue a sheep hybrid, only to find their blows passing through empty air. Their target moved too fast, slipping between strikes like smoke. In another section, shouts erupted as several humans clutched their heads, scalded by streams of hot liquid. Above them hovered little Rizoldrak, spitting bursts of fiery breath with the last of his strength. So far, Jihan and Rhea hadn't needed to join the fray. The battle was flowing exactly as planned. Still, he stayed alert, watching every shift in the fight. Nearby, the short man regrouped with two of his allies, weapons drawn. They aimed at the rabbits tunneling through the soil, hoping to catch them off guard. Seeing the danger, Ji-han called for Rhea. The fox girl darted forward, a blur of motion. Even Ji-han, who had seen her fight before, was stunned by her speed. She reached the group in mere seconds, but the short man behind them was already readying his crossbow. He fired. The arrow cut through the air, heading straight for Rhea. She saw it a heartbeat before impact, and to everyone's disbelief, twisted her body just enough to dodge it. Rhea shifted her stance, her body flowing with sharp precision as she readied her next move. Without hesitation, she launched forward, her legs slicing through the air and connecting hard with a man's face. He smirked, thinking he'd managed to block her blow, but her speed was beyond what he could follow. Before he could recover, she swept low, spinning from the ground and striking again. This time, her kick landed clean, sending him crashing backward. Without stopping, Rhea pivoted toward the next opponent and drove her heel into his jaw, knocking him flat. The last one, the short man, cursed under his breath, demanding to know what she was doing. They squared off, eyes locked. Then, in a flash, she struck again. Her leg snapped upward and came down with crushing force, slamming his head into the dirt. Groaning, the man clutched his bruised face while the fox girl stood tall. In mere moments, she had taken all three down. Her cold glare swept over them, daring any to underestimate her again. Across the battlefield, the large brute took in the scene. His men were losing, badly. Rage twisted his features as veins bulged along his arms. With a guttural growl, he triggered his ability. His muscles swelled, doubling in size as raw power coursed through him. Ji-han, watching from afar, recognized the transformation immediately. Only C-rank knights, or stronger, could wield active abilities like that. A burst of power that enhanced their physical strength. The rabbits nearby froze, trembling as the ground shook beneath the brute's steps. But the man's confidence vanished when a massive shadow loomed before him. A colossal hand gripped a fallen tree trunk, ripping it from the ground with ease. Standing there was Tor, the bull hybrid, towering at nearly twice the man's size. The brute's face went pale, words failing him. From his vantage point, Ji-han observed the encounter with wide eyes. He hadn't expected Tor to be that powerful. His plan was unfolding better than imagined. Meanwhile, deep inside the cave, the long-haired mercenary grew restless. None of his allies had returned from the other tunnels. Muttering curses, he finally decided to move. Pointing toward the path the larger fighter had taken, he ordered his group to follow that route. Back in the village, victory was already sealed. Every remaining invader had been captured and buried. Ji-han turned to Tor, asking if his legs were holding up after the fight. The bull nodded, though the exhaustion showed. Even though the villagers outnumbered their enemies, many were injured. But Ji-han refused to slow down now. He could sense more soldiers approaching from the cave's exit. He called to Tor again, ordering him to prepare the next line of defense. The bull grunted and began distributing weapons to everyone.